No signal. All right.
It's there now.
What's there? Oh, that's good, right.
Good one.
I'm going to assume that Pastor Derek and I will be continuing the Book of Acts in the next weeks, and although Pentecost might interrupt that, although of course you might find Pentecost in the Book of Acts anyway. So I don't want to go in the Book of Acts. So what I've decided to do today was to go from the end of the Book of Acts until about the year 300, or maybe 400. So that's where I'm going to go. So I'll leave, as it were, for once, the theology to the professionals, and I'll just tell you a bit of history. There'll be lots of highly brainy powered atheists I'll be quoting this morning, which I'm sure you'll enjoy. And this is because I think we can learn a lot from the primitive church. And I just ask that all this information will be useful to you in your Christian life and your Christian communication, as has already been mentioned, communication. Now, Roman history interests people very much. It interests me also. I like history in general, and Roman history is very popular on the telly, and you see lots of people talking about Roman history from people like Mary Beard, who is actually a classicist, not a historian. But she has an interest in the Roman period, and I think her husband's a historian. She's also a feminist, so she reads Paul saying that women be silent, and so, right, that's it, that's gone. All Paul's writing don't mean anything to her. Simon Sharma, I saw him one time, and he was talking about, he recognised that the early church really grew fast. And he had this really weird idea from a painting he saw on a catacomb in Rome, which he explained why the church grew like it did. But I didn't, that was, for somebody so intelligent, I thought, well, how could that? Anyway, you maybe didn't see that. But they do historians, of course, do recognise that the church did grow rapidly in the Roman Empire. And like I say, I think we can learn things from that period that help us today, because the early primitive church was existing in a pre-Christian society. And sometimes you look around our society and you think we're maybe in a post-Christian society or a nearly post-Christian society. And so there are similarities to our society. Now, obviously, I'm not either a historian nor an academic, nor do I understand Greek and Latin. So I've leaned very heavily on John Dixon, Professor John Dixon. So I'm giving him credit now, because I don't want you to think, Godfrey knows a lot of stuff, because I don't speak Greek and I don't speak Latin. And I haven't spent hours researching stuff that's relevant to this. And I haven't spent hours in subterranean archives digging out old documents. So I'm leaning on him. Now, on the desk in front of him, just an aside, I believe is an ancient document found in Egypt, which is the first hymn that we have written down. They've got the words and the music, and they've made a hymn. Now, John Dixon's actually also a musician, but he's that's on your sort of a sideline, and so he's co-opted with Matt Redman and Ben Fielding, I think, to write the first hymn, which is now available to listen to. And to me, as somebody who's interested in history, I like the idea of connecting with the primitive church through that. So that's what he's doing there. that's just, like I said, aside. Now, the growth of Christianity in the first 3 centuries is by anyone's reckoning remarkable. So, here are some examples of what the experts reckon the church had grown by the time Constantine declared himself a Christian in 312. So, you may recognise Gibbon as a historian and so on. And as you can see, the highest estimate there is Rodney Stark of 6 million, or 10%. And the lowest there is described by John Dixon as the party pooper of Academy, Ben Ehrman, who has it down at 4%, 2.5 million. Now, when experts get all these figures, different figures, what they do is they get an average, which we have here, of 4.4 million, 7.3%, as you can see there. So that is real growth. Robin Lane Fox, who is no friend of the Christian faith, said this: no other cult in the empire grew at anything like the same speed as Christianity. So we say, how did they do it? And to achieve that growth from a few hundred to a few million is needed a 30% growth decade by decade by decade. That is amazing. And you've got to wonder how they do it, and you wonder what it would be like if we had a 30% growth per decade instead of the decline that the last census showed, which I don't know how clear that is. It's hard to find British figures, or I didn't find a better example than that of how church has grown. The Church of England has had massive decline, and the new churches, as they call them, have more or less stayed level. So where all those Anglicans have gone, I don't know, but there's been also a steep rise in the last census of people saying they have no religion. And this is due to all sorts of things, but a lot of people think it's to do with the immigration. But when you look at the figures, the big rise has been with people with no religion. There has been rises in other faiths, but nothing like to account for that decline in the faith that we've seen, and that's the figures from the last census, people who claim this. So to achieve 30% per decade, per decade, per decade, how did they do it? And they did it with no political power. They had no political power, no legislation to help them, and even they didn't have much money. So how did they do it? It really is a question. Now, of course, going back to the book of Acts, you could say, well, the Lord added to their number daily, and that's enough. Shall we stop there and have tea? Well, perhaps not. As a famous Irishman said, there's more. And so this John Dixon had done all this research, and he observed 4 things from his research. So I'm thinking he spent years doing this. He probably knows what he's talking about. And this is something he said: evangelists proclaimed the gospel as all Christians promoted the gospel. And so we can save ourselves all that time of learning Greek and Latin. Although, of course, I recognise people here have been professionally trained and they know Greek and Latin. I don't. I know caveat emptor and stuff like that. That's Latin, you know. But I don't speak Latin. So this is what he's observed from his research. Now, you, being a historian and an academic, he answers what other people say. So, a lot of scholars think there was no mission in the church, in the early church, in this Roman period. For example, Ramsay MacMullen, obviously Yale, that's obviously a well-known university, concluded from the turn of the 2nd century, the mentions of missionary efforts, never abundant, taper off. It made no organised or official approach to unbelievers. After St. Paul, the church had no mission. I might find that surprising. Even when, you know, even now we might find that surprising. It is a widespread one, and our party pooper appears again. Barton, Distinguished Professor of University of North Carolina. Outside of Paul's work itself, we do not know of any organised Christian missionary work, not just for the 1st century, but for any century prior to the conversion of most of the empire. So it's like he's saying, there weren't Christians until Constantine said Christian, and everybody says, oh, we'll be a Christian across the emperors, which is not true. That's not what happens. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, somebody you may have heard of, Michael Green, some of you may have read his works, the late great Michael Green, said there's no distinction in the early church between full-time ministers and laymen in this responsibility to spread the gospel by every possible means.
Absolutely.
So, how is it that academics can come to such opposite conclusions? But that's the way it is, and it would be reasonable to wonder this thing. Now, Professor Dixon, I say, who's researched this, he said this is possibly because the evidence is mixed and very hard to interpret. And maybe he's being generous there to fellow academics. I don't know. But it's true that all Christians from this period did not see themselves as evangelists in any exact sense. But what we can find are prominent Christians who were effective public advocates for what we might call apologists today. And people like Quadratus. Now, he wrote a letter to the Emperor Hadrian, who was better known for building a wall round here. And then Justin Martyr is a name that you might have heard bandied about. And the little known today Arminian lady Nuni, who almost single-handedly converted the country that we now call Georgia to Christianity. That is astounding, what she did. And there are lots of evidence. He's found lots of evidence, less overt but no less effective missionary activity, like praying for the proclamation of the gospel, doing good works, living good lives, and learning how to answer questions about the gospel. In other words, the evidence is twofold. So it might be a good point here to see what Paul said about this in Colossians. And pray for us too, that God may open a door for our message, so that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ, for which I am in chains. Pray that I may proclaim it clearly as I must. Be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you must answer everyone. 'Cause Now, note what he says about proclamation, that he and his team proclaim, and that he specifically must proclaim clearly. See also, like all commentators, that he does not say the same thing to the Colossians. He says that they must live wisely and be prepared to answer graciously. And they must, like I say, answer graciously. So this is what he said they would do. Notice also the double use of the word day, the word in parenthesis there, which means it is necessary or must. So just as the team had a duty, so did the Colossians. It's just not the same duty. Evangelists proclaimed the gospel, as all Christians promoted the gospel. And this is exactly what he found in the many documents during this time of rapid Christian expansion. John Dixon has been doing a comprehensive study of all the things said about mission in Latin and Greek between 100 and 400 AD, which he hopes to publish. So any of you people who like a good heavy tome to prop up the table and read in the meantime might want to look out for that book when it appears. Because I do have a book of John Dixon's at home, which I was reading at the stop to prepare this. But it's about the same period, but on a different topic. And so this is what we find. He'll find. So this is he has found three things that appear all the time. So he finds numerous references to specific preachers and public defenders of the gospel. 2, no explicit exhortations for Christians in general to proclaim the gospel. Lots of references to a wide variety of things Christians do to promote the gospel. And in this last category, he finds examples of clergy telling wealthy Christians not to build bigger baths and bigger homes, but rather to sponsor evangelists and build places of worship on their properties. In one case, these things are described as the work of an evangelist, although this doesn't involve the lips at all. And there's good evidence that Christians were schooled in how to answer questions from Greeks and Jews who criticised the faith. There seems to be these seem to be the backbone of mission for ordinary Christians in being able to answer and do these things. Now, here is one example and this comes from Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, and this is about 50 years after Paul, and he was arrested and taken to Rome, and he was allowed to write letters while he was imprisoned. And the letters exist today. He writes this letter. Pray continue for the rest of humankind as well, that they may find God. For there is in them the hope of repentance. Therefore, allow them to be discipled by you. Then there's a Greek word, at least by your deeds. In response to their anger, be gentle. In response to their boast, be humble. In response to their slander, offer prayers. In response to their errors, be steadfast in the faith. In response to their cruelty, be civilized. Do not be eager to imitate them. Let us show by our forbearance that we are their brothers and sisters, and let us be eager to be imitators of the Lord. That's a tremendous letter written from prison, and you can't just help remember Paul writing from prison and so on, and Ignatius is in the same position only 50 years later. Although obviously that's not the Bible, it sounds a lot like the Bible, doesn't it? Somebody in the same situation. Now, I mentioned some of you know a bit of Greek, and you may understand that Greek word. I don't know if anybody understand that. This is the same Greek word that we see in Matthew 28, in what is known as the Great Commission, where it says, "Make disciples of all nations." That is the same word there that Ignatius is using in this letter. Just so you see an even greater, strong connection to what Jesus said. Now, in our times, we may be anxious about Christian witness, and this may have two effects. It may cause us to retreat. And I'm guessing that wouldn't be a good idea. Most of you would think that was not a good idea. And the other thing is to lash out. That's what anxiety causes. But it also has two effects. And one is that we can become paralysed with guilt if we are not good talkers. And not know what. As soon as we get questioned, we get stuck, we get paralysed with guilt. We can't really answer. We see here that but be encouraged if you feel that way, because the gospel is not reduced to proclamation only, as we have seen from Paul to the Colossians, and Ignatius to the Ephesians, and our own Derek and Anne, as I hear them, say the same thing. And if these ancient Christians can teach us anything, it is that these gospel promoting activities in partnership with proclamation can actually turn an empire upside down. A second thing the ancient church can teach us is the gospel preached to the world closely resembles the content of the written gospels. The early church proclaimed salvation through the forgiveness of sins, and the ancient church actually held this message of salvation through forgiveness of sins through the message to the whole narrative of Jesus' life. It's like a theological punchline to what they said about Jesus' life. His teachings, healings, trial, death, resurrection, appearances, and return. Their gospel was what we find in the Gospels. Now, Mark opens his gospel with the words, "The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." For Mark, the gospel he goes on to tell in written form is all about Jesus' life, teaching, death, and resurrection. Now, here's a quote to back up that idea, that the Gospel of Mark 1:1 can hardly be taken as intended merely to name a literary genre, a gospel. Rather, gospel here also refers to the good news as proclaimed, though set forth here in written form. To this extent, Mark's gospel amplifies the outline of Peter's sermon to Cornelius in Acts 10 and indicates the broader scope of the church's preaching than simply the death, resurrection, parousia, that is return of Jesus Christ. Robert A. Gulick. Gulick is simply here referring to something that an Oxford scholar, C.H. Dodd, noticed years previously, the profound structural similarities between the Gospels and the evangelistic speeches of the apostles as recorded in the book of Acts. And more support from this idea comes from a brand new volume by Simon Gathercole. And I don't know, he's saying the same as Gulick and Dobb, but he also details how the Gnostic Gospels bear little resemblance to the earliest Christian teaching. And you might find this useful in certain conversations. I don't know if I mean, lots of people have never heard of the Gnostic Gospels, but every now and again you meet somebody who has. They've seen this Gospel according to somebody on Facebook, which has been quoted or even misquoted or even partially invented, and they think that's in the Bible. And you need to know, if you're going to answer them, what to say. And I've only encountered this about, I think, twice. People quoting stuff to me that's out of the Gnostic Gospel, but it might happen. Anyway, that book will explain to you all about that if you want to get another huge tome. Well, it may be a huge tome, but it's going to be pretty heavy reading, I should think. And that, like I say, you'd probably find it useful to find out what the Gnostic Gospel is. So let's look at an ancient document. So often you hear people say that the Bible was written long after Jesus died. I mean, that's a popular thing I think people say. Most historians will tell you that there are loads of documents that are from the 1st century that establish that it was not written centuries after Jesus died. I mean, one fella who's got a YouTube channel, and he's actually a leading YouTuber in the USA, and he's a nationally known comedian. And he, on this YouTube clip, I didn't bring the YouTube clip because I think he found the language offensive. But he makes 4 statements that are false, and one that is impossible. I mean, he says Constantine wrote the Gospels, and bishops wrote the Old Testament. And you're thinking, and he seems to think he's talking the truth, but he's thinking, where's he getting his stuff from? And loads of people listen to that and think, oh, he's a famous celebrity, he'll know what he's talking about, but he doesn't. And there's loads of stuff like that. Particularly, you often hear comedians making fun of the Christian faith and saying stuff that is just rubbish. Anyway, there's plenty to establish that the Gospels were written in the 1st century and available to the early church. So on this image, the scribe has written which Gospel is ending and which is starting, as you can see there. And if you can't see, that's end of Luke, start at John. Apparently, they were very careful always to write this, so you know which Gospel is ended, which Gospel is starting. And this means the 2nd generation of Christians received these 4 books, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, as the written copy of the apostolic preaching. That's how they received them. They were existent in the 1st century for the 2nd generation of Christians that were there, and they weren't invented later. You may get a chance to, if you can remember all that, when anybody says otherwise, you'll be able to answer them, hopefully, from that. Now, we'll have a look at another 2nd century, move on to the 2nd century, and this is Irenaeus of Lyon. And he came from Smyrna, and and he provides, I think, a link with the here and now when he ended up in Lyon as bishop there. And he was said to be the leading theologian of the 2nd century. So I'm sure any Bible students would have read it. Anyway, so Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp, who was said to be a disciple of John the Evangelist. So it's quite a close link to Bible time and New Testament times. Here he states that the books are the preaching of the apostles. We receive the knowledge of the economy of our salvation through no others than those through whom the gospel has come down to us. The gospel the apostles first preached orally, but later by God's will they handed it on to us in scriptures, so that it would be the foundation and pillar of our faith. They went forth to the ends of the earth, bringing us the good news. They collectively, and each of them individually, equally possessed the gospel of God. Matthew accordingly produced the writing of the gospel to the Hebrews in their own language, whereas Peter and Paul evangelized at Rome and founded a church there. But after their departure, Mark, Peter's disciple and translator, handed down to us in writing what was preached by Peter. Luke, too, Paul's follower, set down in a book the gospel that was preached by Paul. Later John, likewise the Lord's disciple, who had also rested on his breast, issued the gospel while living at Ephesus. Now that passage might have taught you a lot about early Christians. I don't know, to me it did. It said a lot of things that I've heard in sermons and stuff. And you think, well, is that close to the 1st century? Surely his sources were pretty reliable. And what this means to us is that ancient Christians heard the message of salvation alongside and part of the message of Jesus, teacher and risen Lord, exalted in heaven. And they trusted the risen Jesus for salvation through forgiveness of sins. At the same time, they're also dipping their toes into discipleship. And we are familiar with teaching that encourages people to believe in Jesus, and then at some later stage, we find the small print of discipleship. And this separation of salvation and discipleship does create problems, which the early Christians managed to avoid. And this leads us to his third observation. Evangelization took place through a surprisingly long program of education. Now I'm going to really compress what he said here to get to make on. The early church was seen by outsiders more as a scholastic community than as a mystery religion. Now, Professor Edwin Judge, the celebrated Roman historian of Macquarie University, that's in Australia, not in England, not in Oxford, published 2 essays on this subject 50 years ago. And here's an extract from them, which I won't read for sake of time. More recently, Claire Smith tested this with a detailed linguistic analysis of Paul's writing. She found the same thing. Churches could be described as scholastic communities in the 1st century. As time went on, the churches developed this education. I think it's called catechesis, I think it was called. By the year 200 in Rome, pagans who wanted to know about the Christian faith were invited to an hour's lesson before church for 3 years. That's at least 144 hours. By AD 300 in Jerusalem, if you wanted to do this quickly, I have the deal for you. You can go to Jerusalem 3 hours a day, 6 days a week, for the 7 weeks leading up to Easter. And then you would be baptized on Easter Day. To me, it's astounding. This is just to get baptized. You don't think of this. I've never previously thought of it being like that, really. And there are about 20 surviving lectures from this course. These apparently are full of stuff which helps people answer the questions that skeptics, critics, non-believers might bring. And we have plenty of non-believers, skeptics, critics today, so one thing we do is learn how to answer. So there's. I won't read that out again for sake of time. And remember, this is just for baptism. This is the evidence that believers are schooled to answer unbelievers. Now, you might be pleased to know at this point that I'm not saying this on behalf of Derek and Anne, that they're thinking of introducing this 144 hours of study as part of the evangelism thing. And when they listen to this recording, they'll be even more pleased than you. So I'm not suggesting that at all, but I'm saying this is what they did. And this is part of a component of how the church expanded. And so I do, like I say, I do believe we can learn from this. Now, hearing all that, you may think that becoming a Christian was being made unnecessarily difficult back then. And they might reply that at that time there was a profound lack of understanding of the Christian or biblical worldview. And this required not only a lot of learning, but also a lot of unlearning to realise just what they were getting into. Also, there was a lot of pressure from Roman society for Christians to give up their faith. And sporadically, this was full-blown persecution. Not all the time, but sporadically, serious persecution. And people needed to know what they were getting into. I think that today, in our nearly post-Christian society, we can see a similar lack of understanding. And we often hear believers bemoaning how things are getting worse. Well, when you see what they lived in, we know it's not as bad as that. So we've got to make on, as I say. And that's why I chose this subject, because I think that what they did is relevant to be applied in our culture in different ways, of course, but the same things need to apply for us today. So that's why I chose the subject. I mean, I go to these quizzes now and again with former neighbours, and when a Bible question comes up, the ignorance to me is surprising. The just blank looks, particularly from people about 50 downwards, and so the society today really knows nothing about our Christian heritage. So, it comes to a fourth observation. Because they knew Christ had won, they entered the fray with confidence and accepted defeat with grace. Now, you'll be pleased to know I'm nearly there. There was a paradox in early Christian writings which every historian will notice, and that is the early Christians were narrow-minded but broad-hearted. Now, that, if you only see one side of that, you'd be like Nietzsche, who was an atheist philosopher, but he was also a classicist. And he described, he saw the church promoting this in this way that they changed the values, making power and wealth bad and poverty good, sort of thing. That's what he saw it, and you read stuff and you might actually get that idea. It's quite compelling, and it seems to make logic. But to quote John Dixon again, except for this pesky thing of historical evidence. And so let's have a look at one historical example. Tertullian, who you may have heard quoted, he was from Carthage, that was his home, and Scapula was the Roman governor of Carthage, who was brutal to the Christians. And so let's see what Tertullian said to Scapula. We are neither dismayed nor greatly disturbed at the persecution we suffer from ignorant men, since we join this way of life with understanding that we pledge ourselves to enter into the present conflicts at the risk even of our lives. For we are commanded by the teachings of our religion to love even our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us. We, then, are saddened by your ignorance. We have compassion on human error. We worship one God, whom you all know, since nature is your teacher, at whose lightnings and thunder you tremble, at whose benefits you rejoice. The rest of the deities you yourselves think to be gods, but we know be demons. There are two clear postures here. Christians are right, the empire is wrong. But there is this cheerful resolve humbly to love even persecutors. So that is not a slave mentality, is it? He isn't talking like a slave or somebody cowed, but at the same time he's not spitting bile and hatred. And there's other examples from the same time, which for sake of time I won't quote. But the point is, the Christians, knowing they had already won, there was no need either to lash out or retreat. They reasoned that Christ had been executed by Rome, but had been raised by God. Amen. And they are the death and resurrection people. Victory is assured. Great attitude, great attitude. Because they knew Christ had won, they entered the fray with confidence and accepted defeat with grace. Their role was to pray, to persuade, to serve, and to suffer. They had the audacity to believe. That's all they needed to bring a pre-Christian world to Christ. And a couple of hundred years later, after Tertullian, they were proved right. 4.4 million or 7 million or 10 million, whatever it was. It's a huge expansion. That concludes it, really. So I hope that helps you when you're talking to people and you get all these arguments. So, some of that I'm sure you will find useful. And I wish you success in your proclamation if you do that, or promotion if you choose to do that. Either way, as long as the word gets out. Thank you.